What exactly happened to Eliud Kipchoge in this year's Boston Marathon? There have been tons of theories floating around as to exactly what happened with the GOAT of the 26.2-mile distance, but some of them are just so wild and some of them do make a lot of sense. So today I wanted to run through exactly what happened to the greatest marathoner of all time in this year's Boston Marathon and give my 2 cents on exactly why I think he did not perform quite as well as many people expected. Now, if you haven't heard already, Kipchoge was defeated in a rare loss in this year's Boston Marathon. In fact, he finished in 6th place in 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 23 seconds. And since this loss, we've learned a lot about what happened, about what Kipchoge felt during the race, about the importance of getting your water bottle, and if you do miss it, there can be dire consequences. But that's just one of the theories. Yes, he did miss his water bottle sometime after the 30-kilometer split, and pretty soon after that is when Kipchoge was dropped and he was unable to come back to the lead athletes. Now, this is a big deal, as keeping up with your nutrition in a 2-hour-plus run is super important. There's been studies that showcase if you do not get early nutrition during your marathon performance, the last half of this race is going to be a complete nightmare. And while this is a big deal that he did miss his water bottle, I don't think it's quite as important as many people think, because it only took a few minutes after this water bottle miss for Kipchoge to drop. And in this brief amount of time, it doesn't really make sense that this water bottle miss would showcase such a severe reaction to his body. So while it did make a difference, I think, down the line towards the end of the race, I don't think in that exact moment it prevented Kipchoge from closing the gap on Gabriel Guillet up front. Now, another theory that I think is actually pretty solid is the rain and shoes theory. He was running in his classic Nike Alpha Flies, one of the freshest shoes on the market, but what many people are positing is that with the rain, his shoes actually held a lot more water than many other athletes who were not wearing Nike shoes, and this simple fact added extreme weight throughout the entire race. Imagine running in waterlogged shoes through a marathon. That is going to hurt any part of your body down the line. And this negative consequence from the rain kind of lines up with what Kipchoge expressed after the race. In a post-race interview, Kipchoge said that he was unable to bring up his left leg as much as he wanted to. And if you're having an issue like that where you literally cannot lift your leg, of course you're not going to run to your full potential. That is a big issue, and perhaps this was brought on by the heavier shoes from the rain. Perhaps this was something that just inevitably was going to happen on the day. But if you do take a closer look at the Nike Alpha Flies, it does make sense that water could eventually get into them, and they could potentially stay heavier than other athletes. And this theory also holds a little bit more water when you realize that the front 3 athletes are all endorsed by Adidas. Now, I have no clue whether or not there was water that got into these shoes, but the fact that they are different shoes does make somewhat of a difference. And of course, the winner was Eliud Kipchoge in 2 hours, 5 minutes, and 54 seconds, followed closely by Gabriel Guillet, and then in third was Benson Kipruto. Now, these are some of the best marathoners in the world, extremely talented. In fact, Eliud Kipchoge won last year's Boston Marathon, and Benson Kipruto won the 2021 Boston Marathon. So we're talking absolute marathon elites here, but they did beat Kipchoge by more than 3 minutes, which is a huge margin in the marathon. Now, missing your water bottle and performing with heavy shoes potentially could showcase big problems. But I think the biggest issue for this race was Eliud Kipchoge's upfront running. And when you do this, you're pretty much acting as a pace setter. And when you pace a race, you are breaking the wind for every other athlete in the field, and you're inevitably losing more energy. Now, there was one key point in the race where Kipchoge was visibly frustrated at the fact that he was still in the lead. And again, this is a huge issue. This is why pace setters pace races. This is why athletes who sit behind pace setters typically run much faster than they would otherwise. And if you'll notice, Eliud Kipchoge tucked behind Kipchoge pretty much for the first half marathon. So this was clearly a benefit to him, but the fact that Kipchoge was up front pushing was just not good for him down the line. And I think this racing strategy was more or less what he had coming into this race. He's obviously the greatest athlete of all time in the marathon, and I think the mindset for him and his team was go out solid through the first half, push a good bit, drop a good bit of the field, and then down the line over the final kilometers, you can use your classic endurance and pretty much leave everyone else in your dust. The fact that nobody else was even up front with him, setting some kind of tempo, at least running on his side, made it very challenging for him to win down the line. Even in his post-race interview, he clearly was frustrated about the fact that he was up front pacing for so long. He didn't outright say that he was mad about it, but he pretty much said that you can see for yourself that I was up front leading for the first half. That's what was happening. And when someone does this, it obviously is not to their advantage. I think that there were just so many moving parts to this year's Boston Marathon that were against Kipchoge's race plan, and potentially I do think the hills were somewhat of a surprise. Now again, he did run a fantastic time, and at the end of the day, he broke 2 hours and 10 minutes on a visibly bad day, which is pretty fantastic. But there were just so many pieces that did not work out in his favor this year, and I think the biggest piece of it was probably the pace setting, because running up front with other people directly behind you is not a recipe for victory. Now, it's pretty interesting to note that Kipchoge's only 2 marathon losses since 2013 were during marathons where there was a decent amount of rain. In the 2020 London Marathon, there was a lot of rain. And now in 2023 in the Boston Marathon, there wasn't quite as much rain, but there was still visibly a decent amount of rain. And that did not work out to Kipchoge's favor at the end of the day. Perhaps there were other factors going on, but I think the pace setting combined with the rain, the brutal hills of Boston, and the issue when it comes to his shoes very much could be variables that worked against Kipchoge on this day. But Kipchoge is still Kipchoge, and many people have pointed out that even on one of his worst of worst days, where he closed beyond 3 minutes and 10 seconds for the final kilometers, he still finished 6th, he still broke 2 hours and 10 minutes in Boston during the rain. Kipchoge is still Kipchoge. If we look back to his previous loss, where he finished 8th in the 2020 London Marathon, this just might have been the inflection point of huge inspiration, because for his next race he ran 2:04:30, winning the NN Mission Marathon. For his next race, he completely dominated the 2020 Summer Olympics, and then after that, he went on a rampage of records, breaking the course record in the 2021 Tokyo Marathon in 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 40 seconds, and then he smashed his own world record in last year's Berlin Marathon in 2:01:09. Perhaps this race will yet be another moment where Kipchoge takes a loss, learns from his mistakes, and then comes back even stronger. Or perhaps this could be the inevitable time barrier where Kipchoge reaches his top potential and other athletes from around the world finally do start to match what Kipchoge has been doing for the past decade. It's impossible to know what will happen in the future, but one thing is for certain, this year's Boston Marathon was tough, and not just on Kipchoge, but pretty much on everyone else in the race. A final factor that I think played a big role was the temperature, which was around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or right around 10 degrees Celsius. This is almost the exact temperature of the 2020 London Marathon, and when you combine the cold with the rain, it is much more difficult to maintain your internal temperature. So for Kipchoge, who stands at 5'6" and around 115 pounds, you're looking at an athlete that has very, very little body fat, which potentially could have played a role in his energy levels going down. As many of you know, he has mentioned that he wants to win all 6 marathon majors, which no athlete has ever done in marathon history. And to this day, the only checkboxes that remain are Boston and New York. So logically, it would make sense that his next marathon in the fall would be the New York City Marathon. But given this loss in this year's Boston Marathon, perhaps his plans will change. Perhaps they'll stay the same where he'll go to New York. There's just so many things that happened in this year's Boston Marathon, and there's no definitive way to say whether or not this happened, whether it be his shoes or the temperature, the rain, the wind. It all very much could have played a factor together. So with all of this information in mind, now I want to hear from all of you. What exactly do you think happened to Kipchoge in this year's Boston Marathon? And what do you think Kipchoge will do for his next marathon moving forward? And on that note, thank you very much for watching, and as always, until next time.